Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Genevieve Westcott with the latest financial news from the rural heartland here at home and around the world. In this edition, is it the end of the golden weather for those sky-high commodity prices? What's going up and what's coming down? Who's taking home a bigger pay packet? Rural workers or those city slickers? And among the agricultural sectors, who's enjoying the biggest wage increase? And finally, some relief at the petrol pumps. But will it last? Fingers crossed as we find out. The future of oil prices. All this and much, much more coming up. One of the biggest financial stories unfolding is the crash of commodities around the world. Joining us now to tell us more is ASP rural economist James Shortall. James, always great to see you.
Always good to be here.
So the commodity prices are finally coming down.
Well, they finally come down, but I don't think it's going to last for too long. I do still think that commodity prices are going to remain high.
Oh, and overall, over the past year, they've gone up 25%. That is incredible.
Well, if you look at some of the commodities in particular, then the increases have just been phenomenal. I mean, we talk about cotton, that's been huge, those increases. But, you know, just to go back to some of the things we did see last week, a $10 fall in the price of oil over one night, that's phenomenal. I mean, that's something that we're not going to see too much in the future, I don't think.
Are you picking that oil prices are going to continue to go down?
No, I think that oil prices are probably going to stabilise a little bit, and there's still some potential for some upside. And I mean, we're still seeing the fundamentals of demand and that sort of thing coming through. I mean, China, they're still growing. All those key factors are going to be critical for commodities around the world.
Now, what should investors be weighing up right now if they want to get into the commodity racket? What would your best advice be? Well,
be prepared to lose your shirt, I guess, is one way to look at it. I think, you know, commodities are so volatile, and there's so many things that are going on at the moment. It's very weather dependent, and we are seeing a lot of changes in the weather at the moment that are impacting on commodities, particularly agricultural commodities, but also demand factors are quite critical. So, you know, out of China particularly, that's really driving the prices of oil, but also for some of the metals, which is good for Australia. Okay,
we're going to talk about Greece a bit later in the show, but let's talk about the US. Jobless numbers out are a little bit better.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So last week we of course saw the big drop in commodity prices, and then so that saw equity markets fall. Then on Friday, the jobless numbers came out, and it actually provided some pretty good news for the US economy. And commodity prices stabilised, and equity markets actually increased. So the unemployment rate lifted, but more people are being employed, and that should be good for the US economy.
Although it's still at an 8-month high, correct? And what, 140 million Yankees can't find work?
Well, that's right. I mean, at least we're starting to see some positive factors with the increasing number of people being employed. But with that comes the fact that more people are probably going to start looking for jobs. So, you know, that means that if there's more people looking for jobs, there's potentially more people that are going to be out of work, and that's why we've seen that unemployment rate increase to 9%.
But the problem, of course, remains trillion-dollar deficits in the U.S. How are they ever going to come to grips with that?
Well, it's going to take time, in my opinion, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be you know, we're going to see some pain, as we are going to see some pain here in New Zealand too. But the US probably going to see more pain, and you know, there's going to be some effects over probably five to 10 years before they can really work through this.
And 77 million baby boomers in the US of A are apparently afraid to retire.
I don't blame them. I mean, you know, house prices have fallen, equity markets have fallen over 3 years. While they're still returning to some pretty decent levels, you know, the net wealth of the average American has fallen quite significantly, and you know, that's going to have a big impact on them going forward and their ability to retire in the life that they've become to lead.
Yeah, 1 in 4 boomers are saying they're never going to be able to afford to retire. So well, that's a scary prospect.
Oh, I think it's a scary prospect for all, and you know, something that will be playing in the back of their minds, I guess, with their decisions in the future.
Talking about housing prices in the U.S., interesting to see that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, says that our housing is overvalued by 25%. Rents are 43% higher than they should be.
And like the housing market, they're also saying the currency is overvalued, which is you know, has had an effect on the New Zealand dollar over the past day, falling about you know, 0.5% against the US dollar. But yeah, I mean, the housing market here is one that's been sort of underpinned by a couple of key areas, Auckland being one of them, and we have seen a massive increase in debt in the housing sector, as we have also in the agricultural sector.
Talk now that they're going to be bringing in prefab houses from China to help rebuild Christchurch. Is this the right way to go?
Well, to be honest, my personal opinion is that I wouldn't want to see big developments with the prefab houses. They all look the same. I mean, bit of an eyesore in my opinion, but it does solve a problem in the short term, and it's it's a cost-effective solution. It gets people in homes. They seem to be pretty reasonable quality. So there's got to be a bit of give and take, and some people are going to be prepared for that.
Meantime, farm workers are doing better than city slickers apparently when it comes to taking home some money.
Well, they get it. Their pay rises have been more than the city folk over the past year, and I think that's going to be quite key for farmers to be aware of that, because potentially their farm workers are going to be reading the papers and be expecting to be paid a little bit more, or to see a bit of an increase in their salaries. But of course it's a reflection of how well the sector's doing, and the willingness of farmers to pay their workers a little bit more and let them enjoy and reap the rewards that they're also seeing.
James, thanks very much. Stand by. Coming up after the break, Osama bin Laden may be buried at sea, but the American killer king hit on the terrorist is still causing ructions in the Middle East. Is it a good time for Murray McCully to be drumming up private aid from the likes of Fonterra to pour into Afghanistan? And what are those recent sales of some pretty big farms signal here in New Zealand? It's all ahead. But first, answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. How much will the government pump into cleaning up New Zealand's rivers and lakes over the next 5 years? Find out when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how much will the government pump into cleaning up New Zealand's rivers and lakes over the next 5 years? The answer, the new freshwater cleanup fund will be worth $93.7 million. Joining us now is Professor Usha Haley, who specializes in international business at Massey University, with a focus on Asian and emerging markets. And she's put the killing of Osama bin Laden under the spotlight. What are the implications, Usha, for stability in the Middle East?
Stability in the Middle East. It seems to be a pipe dream, really. I don't think it's going to affect the Middle East per se, more Afghanistan and relations with India.
You were just back from the United States.
Yeah.
What was the reaction there with the news that Osama bin Laden had been taken out?
Dancing in the streets, wrapping up in flags, etc. Bit strange for Kiwis, but great for the U.S. And it's a natural U.S. exuberance.
USA! USA! USA!
It's going to be delicate times, too, for American authorities, of course, because Pakistan, as we know, Usha, has nuclear warfare. And how is it going to affect India, for example? How is it going to change there? What are you seeing?
Well, India is saying, I told you so, because India had always said that Pakistan had been harboring Osama bin Laden. And the Pakistanis, of course, are saying, we knew nothing about it. But this is a dilemma, because either the Pakistanis are portrayed as incompetent or they're portrayed as double-dealing, and neither one is great for an ally to be. Pakistan is going to be under great scrutiny, and I do think there might be some reduction of aid, and certainly aid to the army is going to be under much more scrutiny.
Now, there's a lot of political instability throughout that entire region. How important is that region to the growing global economy?
It's
Usha?
enormously important because of India, really, and the connections in India's orbit. India and Southeast Asia and East Asia are really seen as huge growth areas, along with China, which, by the way, posted a record surplus today, 4 times what was expected. So that's very interesting as well.
What does that tell you, James? I mean, wasn't China supposedly pulling back now? They were going to restrain themselves a little bit. This clearly is not happening.
Oh, well, I mean, their economy, there's no question that they've been going along very, very well, and I guess the government's just been pulling out a few strings to try and make sure that that doesn't get over to an over bubble. And I mean, that's the quite critical thing. The question is, if they pull those strings a little bit too tight, then that might have a big impact on the rest of the world, because China's becoming, crucially important to us, to Australia, to the US, even in terms of their recovery.
Well, I don't think there's any question of pulling strings here. I mean, it was 4 times what was expected, the trade surplus. And this is taking place while the U.S.-China talks are going on, the strategic and economic dialogue between the U.S. and China. So It's fairly important.
Now, interesting that Murray McCully, one of our government ministers, is keen to get a lot of agricultural expertise through private funding. He's talking to boys at Fonterra, for example, into Afghanistan. Is that a good move, Usha? What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I don't mean to be flip, but what I heard was that the largest cash crop for Afghanistan was poppies.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I'm just wondering where New Zealand and the New Zealand brand fits into all this.
What's the risk moving into a highly volatile nation like that?
I mean, you're literally stepping on mines, on landmines and elsewhere. And it's a fight for one's survival and life. It's dangerous. And I think it'd be very, very scary.
In this part of the world, of course, we think that we're kind of home and hose because we are tied now, James, so closely to China. They want our dairy. They want our meat. Is that a risk, do you think, that we take? Because what if it all turns to custard?
Oh, it definitely is a risk. You know, it'd be nice if we had some differentiation between different markets and where we were selling our products. But right now, the strongest and the fastest horse is China, and that's the one that we're riding on at the moment. So.
But there's a real problem because most countries, including New Zealand, which has a real pool of talent and innovation, want to move up the value-added chain and not just be a commodity exporter. And that's the risk that New Zealand or any other country, a smaller country that trades with China, that's the trap that they fall into.
We've talked about Afghanistan and moving up the value-added chain. What about burger fuel now going into Iraq? What do you make of that, guys?
Oh, it's exciting.
Yeah, why not?
Why not? Tell me more.
Well, I mean, it's a good story for a Kiwi company. They're, you know, it's potentially a bit of a risky move, but why not? I mean, I think we should be encouraging that sort of activity. We want to see Kiwis doing well on the international stage.
Sure, and I think build up a Kiwi brand name. It's interesting though that they're primarily selling to the U.S. Army.
Ah,
that's their big market there.
Yeah, yeah. But once the word gets out, I'm sure the rest of the folk there will be lining up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about Singapore now. They've just had a watershed election. What does that tell us?
Oh, I think, and I hate to put out a cliche, but the fresh smell of democracy is in the air everywhere, it seems. And Singapore is feeling a whiff of it. To an outsider, the very small gains of the opposition party vis-a-vis the PAP may seem like making a mountain out of a molehill, but that's fairly significant for Singapore. So I remember when I worked there, opposition leaders were routinely entangled in lawsuits and jailed, and now they're listening, at least. Social media had a big part to play in this.
Did they?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they got back in with what, 81 out of the 87 seats. I mean, to you and me, that's a landslide.
Yes.
But apparently they're taking that as a severe rebuking from the population.
So might be some repercussions for Kiwis as well as other foreigners, in that they want to limit the number of foreigners on Singaporean soil, and so that could have some sort of indirect effect. Singapore is the highest trade per GDP ratio in the world.
Wow.
So it's very important. It's a strategically important country.
Is there anything from Singapore that we could learn here to sharpen our act?
Not without enormous sacrifice of some of the freedoms that Kiwis enjoy, including freedom of the press, very many political freedoms. Singapore is economically free, but politically and socially it isn't. And so those are some of the trade-offs that that country has made.
I know, Usha, that you concentrate really on the emerging markets and the Asian markets, but how do you feel New Zealand is doing at this point in time? We got a big budget coming out next week.
Frankly, I think given all the shocks that New Zealand has had to put up with, New Zealand is doing well. And I think that speaks well to the resilience, the underlying resilience both of Kiwis and of the economy.
Can we talk a little bit about commodity prices? Let's talk about cotton. That's come down, way down. How's that going to impact on wool prices now for the farmers here at home?
Yeah, well, cotton prices have probably fallen about a quarter since their peaks, and you know, they've been elevated for a good, you know, coming up 12 months now, and it has had an impact on wool prices, in my opinion. I'm still picking that wool prices will be strong, but they may just come off the highs that we've seen them sort of recently, and we probably could see that over the next 12 months. Okay,
from here at home and from Asia, let's go now to Greece. Greece is still the bad boy and being stood in the corner. Next week, I believe, there's a meeting of all the Eurozone finance ministers to ask, what do we do about Greece? Are they going to need more help? What are you hearing?
Oh, we're living in interesting times, aren't we? A death here, a plunging currency there, etc. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the disparaging word pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain are all iffy. I'm going to stick with the murky emerging markets.
Are you? Yeah, that's where the smart money's going to be. James, what are you hearing about the Greece situation?
Well, it's ugly, to be honest.
I mean, do you think there will be a second bailout? Is that possible?
That's the word at the moment, that we probably will see a second bailout, and that bailout could actually. So we're seeing S&P, Standard & Poor's, drop their credit rating, and it's well into the junk bond status now. So you know, for a country, that is significant in itself. But they're also talking about the fact that we may start to see creditors in the bonds being extended out, and so when you're supposed to be paid a lump sum at the end of the term, the government's going to have to come through and say, actually, we can't pay you right now, so we're going to extend that and pay you in three more years. And effectively, Standard & Poor's, that means you're defaulting on payments, and that's pretty significant for a government.
There have been some pretty big farm sales now moving back here to New Zealand, here at home, James, in recent weeks. What's that telling you?
Well, I think there's been a lot more activity in the transactions, and probably one of the key things we've seen some big farm sales. There's no question about that, but we've also seen lots of activity in those farm sales. So there's been receiverships in some cases. You know, large tracts of land have been sold to one particular entity. I've heard that Landcorp bought one tract of land in the Manawatu, but up to 30 bids were received for that land. I mean, that's phenomenal, and that means to me there's plenty more interest, and there's a lot more farmers that are feeling pretty confident about the long-term fundamentals of agriculture. Word
is out of the next 3 to 4 weeks there will be a decision by the powers that be about who gets to buy the Crafer farms. Oh, really? And of course we know that the biggest bid appears to be from Chinese money. What do you think about that, Usha?
No, the same thing I thought before. You know, New Zealand has to be wary about who they sell key national assets to, and that is intimately, I think, linked with the New Zealand identity. New Zealanders have a special relationship with their land. So what does foreign ownership, not just Chinese ownership, but foreign ownership mean for that? China, of course, is a special case, because when money flows out of China, it's generally connected with the state. So what does it mean for New Zealand to have Chinese government control of their farms?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a separate issue.
There could be another big deal in the offing, too, with Chinese money. James, tell me about that.
Well, I mean, who knows? One of the big deals that will be coming up over the next couple of months will be the shares, the South Canterbury Finance shares in Dairy Holdings, as well as a couple of other shareholders are looking to wrap their shares up in totality. So that's going to be an interesting one, because that's a big chunk, and one that I'm not sure that that Kiwis can bite off and to sort of put a deal together, because it could be up to sort of $300–500 million in terms of total assets. So that's a big tract of land, and it's a pretty critical in terms of our dairy industry.
Yeah, and word is that it could be Chinese money. This is going to be a tough call for the government, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and we've seen not only Chinese, but we've seen other international investors coming into the market. But I think, you know, when you start to think about all of the entities that have entered into New Zealand, the PGG Wrightsons, the New Zealand Farming Systems Uruguay, you start to get a pretty good picture of where all the activity is happening, and it's certainly happening in agriculture, and there's certainly a thirst to invest into New Zealand agriculture.
Well, New Zealand shouldn't suffer the same problems that it did in dairy as with forestry. New Zealanders now don't control their forestry industry, and so I think there has to be some soul searching about whether they want the same thing to happen with dairy.
How can we best buffer ourselves moving forward? Usha, what would your best advice be to John Key and the boys?
I'd say tread carefully. I mean, realize that control means more than monetary control. It also means control about how things are run, about quality control, about the dispersion of assets and remittances, and all sorts of other things. And I think all of this has to be tied to New Zealand's strategy. So New Zealand shouldn't just be reacting to foreign money pouring in, but New Zealand should be plotting out a strategy of its own and then looking for opportunities to feed into its strategy.
Because one thing we know for sure in these uncertain times, New Zealand is a little safe haven.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, guys. Stand by. Coming up after the break, Future Proof, what our experts will be tracking over the next 7 days. Where are they heading? But first, a question for you in our Farmers Facts and Figures quiz. How much more does the average farm worker earn compared to the average annual wage and salary income earner? The answer when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how much more does the average farm worker earn compared to the average annual wage and salary income earner? The answer, $8,567, or $45,000, $410 a year, up from about $43,000 in 2009. And now it's time for Future Proof. What's coming up that our experts will be watching? Usha, ladies first. James, I'm sure you'll agree. What are you keeping an eye on?
I'm looking at the Middle East, and I'm also looking at the United States, which had these strange and contradictory job figures coming out, with companies creating jobs, more jobs than they had previously, but with the unemployment rate also rising to 9%. So I'm looking at what's happening in the U.S., which is the largest market in the world.
Now, you've just recently come from the United States, spent some time over there. How are people feeling? What is the mood?
The mood is somber. People are dejected. Many people have just stopped looking for work. There's a very large cadre of underemployed, which is about 20%, 20 to 30% they estimate. And then combine that with a 9% unemployment, that's depressing.
And in the Middle East, of course, there seems to be no end in sight to the unrest. Began with food prices, the cost of bread, now oil prices. What are you going to be watching in particular there, Usha?
Well, I'm looking at the spread of democracy. I'm looking at how Egypt is reacting, Libya, of course, Yemen and Syria, the latest problems in Syria. So yeah, the Middle East does seem very shaky, and it's such an important source of oil, and that's important to the world.
A year from now, just for fun, what do you think oil prices are going to be?
Oh, I'm not going there.
No, it's so big that we can't imagine?
Always falling short.
Are you? Okay, James, what are you going to be keeping an eye on?
I've been watching those river waters in Memphis, to be honest. This is, going back to my days when I was playing on a tennis scholarship in the US, and I spent a lot of time at the University of Mississippi, which is about an hour and a half south of Memphis. And this morning, when I was reading the news, then the floodwaters in the Mississippi River through Memphis are at all-time highs. And I guess the reason I mention this is because it has quite a big impact on agriculture and commodities out of the US market. The Mississippi River is quite critical in transport and getting seeds and that sort of thing. And already we've seen weather conditions impact on the US crops. And that's already having an impact on the prices and also the prices for livestock. So it has been interesting, I think, over the past week. We get these stats that's from the US Department of Agriculture of how much corn's being planted for the year. And last week, when I looked at those stats, only 13% of the US corn crop had been planted, which is very, very low for this time of year. And all of a sudden they get a week of reasonable weather, and that boosts up to 40%. So there's been a lot of farmers on tractors over the past week in the US.
Crazy. And weather here in New Zealand as well has been so unpredictable. We just had the flooding down in the Hawke's Bay. We really don't know where we are anymore, do we, in terms of weather? Farmers are facing some pretty challenging times.
Oh, definitely, and I mean that's been a big factor, I think, over the past 3 to 4 years. This year, weather's had a major influence on both dairy and the sheep and beef sector, but on an international stage, it's also had a huge impact, and we're at the point where feed and grains are at extremely low levels, to the point where they need to really to see an increase. Everything needs to go well, and right now it's not going well.
And of course, we're all watching to see the mother of all budgets coming through next week. It's not going to be good news for any of us, is it, James?
No, I don't think so, but it's going to be tweaking of existing measures, because it's a tightrope at the moment with the political leaders leading up into an election. And the past 24 hours we have heard about KiwiSaver cuts, working for families cuts. So there's going to be tweaks in terms of eligibility, student loans. These are all things that could be tweaked just slightly to improve the government finances, but really we've got to take some big chunks out to make some headway.
Team, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. Thanks to my guests, ASB rural economist James Shortall and Professor of International Business Usha Haley. We love to hear your feedback, so be sure to check out the website. Meantime, as those winds of economic change continue to blow hard, remember this: if you ever find yourself at the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. Keep the faith. See you next time.